In September, we got so much Final Fantasy VII Rebirth news that it was actually kind of overwhelming. Some things actually kind of slipped through the cracks, and there's an interview here that actually came out about 2 weeks ago, and a lot of people seem to miss. Since then, it has resurfaced, and a lot of people are talking about it because it gives away some really interesting details, including details about the ending, which warrant a lot of interesting discussion. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me, because today we got some really fascinating Final Fantasy VII Rebirth news to talk about. So in this interview with BBC, Kitase had some very interesting things to say. Here is what the interview says. The ending is going to be big. The original Final Fantasy VII is famous for one of the most devastating plot twists in video game history. No spoilers here, wink wink. But when Final Fantasy VII Remake made tweaks to its original plots, it got fans wondering whether that moment would also be altered. Producer Kitase told Newsbeat that Rebirth's story will climax in the Forgotten Capital, the location of that iconic scene in the 1997 original. What happens there is going to be a big surprising development, he said, and a hook that gets people interested and motivated to want to see what happens in the final part of the series. So, a cliffhanger then, the Final Fantasy equivalent of The Empire Strikes Back. The second part of the trilogy is a very important one, and I don't think it's going to disappoint, he added. Now, this is really huge because he's saying that there is going to be a big hook here that gets people motivated to want to come back and see the final part of the series. Now, that could very well just be the death of Aerith. Her death at the very end of the game could easily want to hook new players back in and think what's going to happen now. I think that's very much what happens when you're playing the original Final Fantasy VII for the first time. By that point, you're completely hooked into the game and you really want to find out what's going to happen next. It's kind of when the plot of the story becomes personal in a way. They took away one of your party members as the player. But in the context of Final Fantasy VII Remake, it could also mean a lot more. It could mean that there is no clear answer on if Aerith dies. Or it could mean that Aerith doesn't die there. It's really hard to say, but it seems to be that they're spelling out that things are going to play quite differently in that iconic scene, which we've kind of figured for a while now. However, to hear the developers strictly confirm it, that's the interesting part. They are intentionally hyping us up saying this isn't gonna play out like it did in the original, while also in some other interviews telling us that it'll still play out mostly like the original. These mind tricks will continue further with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's just so hard to say, and for many people, that is indeed the exciting part, is that you really don't know what is going to happen next year. But of course, we're thinking in terms of the binary here, right? Aerith dies, Aerith doesn't die, true or false. Yes, one of those things is probably going to happen. It will be either or. I'm willing to bet that if they're talking about this as a big surprise development and we're not seeing it coming, then I don't even actually know what it could be. I mean, none of us really do. I am willing to bet that it has something to do with the Terrierverse. That is to say, Zack's timeline. However, what's going to happen with Zack's timeline, how he's going to intersect, some people are saying that he will run in and deflect Sephiroth's sword. I've heard other theories about Sephiroth possessing Cloud. It's also worth mentioning that there does seem to appear to be at least 2 Clouds, right? Because we have the Cloud in the Terrier timeline that Zack is carrying on his back, and we have the Cloud in our current timeline that we play as in Remake and Rebirth. So what's going to happen with that other Cloud and with this Cloud? I've heard some people suggesting that maybe the Cloud from this timeline will die and be replaced by the other Cloud. There's a lot of wild theories out there about what could possibly happen, but there are a lot of moving pieces here in this story that connecting them is really difficult to do. Like, we know that Zack is alive in that other timeline. That much has been hard confirmed to us. However, it's just so difficult to imagine with the established Final Fantasy VII story how that actually turns the other gear and makes the story move forward. So when he says that there's going to be a big surprise here, I am willing to bet that all the theories that we've made so far, all the conjecture that we've had about the game is going to be proven dead wrong, and everyone is going to be wrong, and we're all going to be super surprised about it. We've all been trying to predict this from the beginning. So many people have been working on it, so many lore masters. I think we're all going to be wrong, and I'm excited to see what they come up with that we just all didn't see coming. Now, the other interesting thing to note here is that they talked about how long it takes to complete the game, with them saying here that Final Fantasy VII Remake's main story took most players between 30 and 40 hours to complete. We asked director Mr. Hamaguchi if players could expect similar playtime from Rebirth, and he said, "I'd just say doing the main story alone, you're looking at 40 to 50 hours to complete without doing anything else. Then, on top of that, we've got so much side content and exploration content in the world. There's actually more side content than there is main story content. So if you're really looking to go into everything, dig deep, explore the world, and find everything, easily looking at over 100 hours if you want to do everything." So this game is on average around 10 hours longer for most players than Final Fantasy VII Remake was. That's good. That reaffirms to me that they're going to be covering a lot of ground in this game, and that is something that they absolutely need to do in order to finish this whole game up in a single trilogy. I remember back when Final Fantasy VII Remake was first coming out, and we noted that if there's going to be 3 games, and the first game is just Midgar, how long is it going to take them to complete the rest of the game if they're doing everything at this scale? Now we have a pretty good idea of what they're going to do, and that is that the second and third game are going to be a little bit longer, and then also too, they're probably going to be significantly less padded in terms of filler content. Like in Remake, you had to revisit the sewers a second time, things like that. That kind of slowed down the pacing game. Honestly, I think if you cut some sections of that game that weren't really that necessary, you probably could have made that a 20-hour game and it would have been all the better for it. But it seems here in Rebirth, they are going to hit the ground running immediately. You're not going to have to worry about much padding, and there is plenty of side content to do. So this game is going to last you much, much longer, and I look forward to spending all 100 hours in Gaia. Now let's talk about the open world, because this game is an open world in the traditional sense of open world. You're not going to be running around like you would in Tears of the Kingdom, able to just go anywhere. There are some restrictions, and they talk about those restrictions here. Here is what they had to say. Like Final Fantasy XVI, Square Enix's most recent PS5 title in the main series, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will feature a large open world area. I don't know if I would agree with the article here on a Final Fantasy XVI featuring the same type of area, but okay, yeah, that's we'll go with that. But Mr. Hamaguchi told Newsbeat that it won't be a go anywhere you want, do anything you want style of game from the get-go like Tears of the Kingdom, and that's fine. That's totally not what Final Fantasy is, and I kind of don't think it's what Final Fantasy should be either, in terms of whenever you look at how the story progression should work in an FF game. I don't think you should be allowed to just go anywhere or do anything. That does not mean that we should not have open world. I almost said Rebirth of the Wild. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is seeking to make a middle ground between the two. Here's what Hamaguchi said. "We start out with a fairly broad area, a fairly wide area to explore," he said, "but there are limitations on it. Then as the story progresses, as the game progresses, you get new abilities and open up new areas. The game expands further and further." Mr. Hamaguchi says developers want the open world to work as one single space, with all towns and all dungeons and everything linked together seamlessly in one space. He said it was a really important feature that we wanted to add to this game. One thing we wanted to focus on was the idea that you're giving the player the opportunity to explore and experience the world. And I agree. You know, one of the things about the older Final Fantasy world maps is that they were almost like a Metroidvania, right? You had to kind of figure out how to get from one point to the next point. The whole world was sort of a puzzle. Then at the end, once you kind of explored everything, you kind of got the ultimate freedom in the form of the airship. But before that, you were figuring out how to get from one place to the next. And it's that big journey that you go on, and having the world slowly open up greater and greater, and this bigger variety of places that you can go. That's what made the game so compelling. And I'm glad to see that that style of gameplay is returning. I think that this is the style of open world that Final Fantasy should go for going forward. And that is to say that I think if they're actually able to nail the open world here, maybe Final Fantasy should lean into becoming an open world series. But as I've said before, whether they go open, whether they go linear. I want them to pick a style and continue to refine it just like they did back in the old days. But please let me know your thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's potential ending and what the big surprise development could be and what you think about the open world. And I'll see you all in the next video.